So as I said, our next speaker is now somebody well familiar to us, Tim Bunning. He's been our #1 question asker in our presentation so far, and we really appreciate your adding some clarity and some perspective. So we're really pleased to have him today because he's a member of the scientific and professional cadre of the senior executives, and he is Chief Technology Officer for the Air Force Research Lab, which is, as we were just discussing, at one of the epicenters for being able to conduct this research that we've been talking about. So without further ado, his full bio is part of the agenda that, again, you can find on the website. I'll be running his slides for him. So Tim Bunning, you want to take it over?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Can you see me as well?
And we can see you.
Okay, great. So it's certainly a pleasure to be here. Topic from my own heart. I spent 5 years as the chief scientist of the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate within AFRL. And then I grew up in that directorate as part of my career. And so coming back to materials, coming back to manufacturing is getting to my roots. I wish this meeting was in person. If it was, I probably would have spent last night with my good friend, Mr. Lockhart. We probably would have had a few beers. We probably would have solved a whole bunch of problems that neither of us would have remembered this morning. But I miss the ability to get out and interact and interface, and look forward to the times when they change and allow us to. And I'd love to come out there. So next slide, please. I was asked to sort of give what I consider to be a list of the key research areas for AFRL. And I'm not going to do that. And I'll sort of give you a why in a moment. But I will give you a sense of what we're sort of pivoting to. There are many lists out there, and I will share some of them with you, depending on who you are, where you sit in the ecosystem, whether you have a near-term view, a mid-term view, a far-term view, whether you have a structural materials bent or a functional materials bent. You bin yourselves against one of these lists. There are lots of crystal balls out there, as people know. If you would have asked us 5 years ago, would we be in the pivot that we are in right now, per the National Defense Strategy, which was just published a couple of years ago? We would not. And so people build these lists and they put a vector out there and they assume they know what that future is going to be. And I always say that the crystal balls are very fuzzy. And then obviously there's rapid geopolitical changes going on. We are in a war with some near peer competitors that we were not in a few years ago. That war is geopolitical and technological right now. We are losing that war in terms of all measures that we use to look at these things. Percentage of GDP going into next generation capability, scale up of the military, number of STEM graduates, number of patents, and my roots, which is a little more academic, just look at the burgeoning quality of high-notch technical papers coming out into the literature. And so those three things, are paint a picture where AFRL is undergoing a massive adjust, I would say. And so I think the better description of what I'm going to talk to you about today is what are those macro changes ongoing in AFRL. I'll first give you a sense, make sure everyone's on the same page of what AFRL is from where I sit. And then I will give you a sense of what those macro shifts are, and then be happy to take questions. So for those of you who don't know us, and I apologize for those who do, I mean, AFRL is a pretty big place. It's executes on the order of about $2.5 billion in core funding, and I'll touch on the flavors of that here in a little bit. We execute another $2.5 billion of other people's money. We believe that's a sign of strength. That means people are coming to us because of our technical prowess, because of our technical capabilities in testing, that they entrust us to shepherd and execute those dollars. About 11,000 employees, about 1,000 of those are military, about 5,000 of those are government. Of those 5,000, probably 3,500 are what I would call S&Es, scientists and engineers, and over 60% of those have at least a master's degree. So fairly highly educated workforce. And then we also have quite a strong, what I would call on-site staff position that's used to supplement our workforce to provide continuity in some of the testing, and quite honestly, to provide some agility that the government workforce doesn't provide. We are all over the map. I'll show you here in a little bit, but generically, we stood up about 25 years ago through the consolidation of 4 former Air Force laboratories in our basic science branch, AFOSR. So next slide, please. So I can't give a brief without the proverbial org chart. This will help a little bit with the answer to where does AFworks sit, who's who in the zoo, as they say. So AFRL is a big place. We're led by, it's now Major General Select Pringle, my boss. That sits at the head shed. A lot of you probably know Jack Blackhurst, has been around for a while. I'm what's called the Chief Technology Officer, really the senior science and technology advisor to AFRL, to the general, and anyone who will listen, as they say. The dark blue boxes are what we would have maybe 7, 8 years ago called our core AFRL. The blue boxes are called technical directorates. They are organized around technical disciplines, things like materials and manufacturing, things like directed energy, things like space vehicles. Off to the left, we took on part of the medical mission a number of years ago, and so that's colored a different color. They have a dual reporting chain up through the acquisition side that we just talked about in the classic AFRL reporting chain, but they also report up through the Surgeon General office, and they do a lot of training for medics, doctors, nurses, etc. All of the Air Force medical staff come through that part of AFRL through what's called the schoolhouse, and it's where we educate our personnel on the medical side. Off to the right, we mentioned AFworks, relatively new, colored in orange because, again, different OpCon, AdCon. Their AdCon comes from us. Their OpCon comes from the SAE, the Senior Acquisition Executive. The two at the top, SDPE and the Transformational Capability Office, again, different color, different OpCon, AdCon. In this case, the Developmental Planning and Experimentation Shop, of which Mr. Lockhart was part of building and getting to full operating capability. We get OpCon from the chiefs, I would say, and then again, AdCon through the AFRL side of the house. So my point in showing this slide is everyone assumes AFRL is a pretty homogeneous system. It is not. There's lots of different color threads. There's lots of different bosses. There's lots of different reporting chains, and it makes my boss's job, General Pringle, very, very difficult sometimes. Next slide. So geographically located, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this slide, just to show you the main locations. We do have an international presence through our basic science office. We have an office in London, an office in Tokyo, an office in Santiago, soon to be added will be an office in Australia. So again, pretty extensive footprint across the country. Next slide. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide. Depending on who you are on this call, you know, one of these boxes means more to you. If you're from academia, you're primarily interested in the left-hand box, basic research. That's work that's primarily funded out of our Air Force Office of Scientific Research. This is primarily grant money. This is money that is issued to academic professors, you know, through competitive proposal writing. Roughly 70% of their money goes to academia on the outside. Roughly 30% goes to fund basic science work within the lab, and then to build that bridge between the two. The 6.2 box is what I would call tech push. So that funds a lot of the government salary, a lot of the on-site technical capabilities that we have as a lab. It does some external work, a little bit of external work with academia, and some external work with industry, but more from an early TRL level, more tech push concept exploration. The 6.3 side is where we typically do our larger demos. This is done primarily with industry, primarily not exclusively, but you know, this is where the big boys come in, the OEMs, the Raytheons, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, etc. And you know, typically these are contracts where we do risk reduction in industry on a capability, a technology, something that we are pushing forward. I like to use this comment because I think it's sometimes lost on people, but that the Air Force, the big Air Force, the operational Air Force, does not buy capability from AFRL. Our job is not to provide capability directly to the operational Air Force. The operational Air Force buys capability through industry. They buy capability through industry. Our job is to work with industry to reduce risk on concepts and topics that near, mid, and far term Big Blue might want. The SDPE 6.4 money been a strong push in this area over the last few years, trying to do more what I would call experimentation out in the field with real working prototypes, typically expensive, typically have the test ranges involved, you have test review board, safety review board, things that you're not going to do, you know, in a more laboratory environment. And so that's been a growing pot of work going on. And then, as I said, we leverage quite a bit of other money. The AFworks money that we just heard about would fall under this bucket of money. It's a different color money, again, executed for Air Force missions. With all that said and done, roughly 50% of the pot goes into salary and infrastructure. And so there are some that say, well, you have $2.5 billion. Why can't you go do whatever you want? Well, I mean, there's a lot of sunk costs, you know, in that $2.5 billion. As I mentioned, and as this slide describes, it's not a single pot of money. There are a lot of multiple colors, and there's a lot of owners and a lot of customers out there, all of whom would argue that they're not getting their fair share of AFRL resources. And then, you know, we tend to have these cycles of what's in vogue, what isn't in vogue, near, mid, far, what's the role of the lab. You know, I would say there's a panic going on in the Pentagon right now. The fight has changed. Everyone doesn't know how we're going to win in a fight with a different competitor if we had to go to war, you know, 5 years from now using the equipment we have today. So that's driven a hyper focus on maybe trying to up our game in the near term to alleviate that fight. And so that's a stressor that's going on right now within the community. Next slide. So some key lists, lots of them out there. National Defense Strategy said here are the most important things we need to go work on. On the right, OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, they have their what are called top 11 modernization priorities. They come down to the labs and say, these are the 11 most things you need to be working on. Air Force Futures, which is a group that stood up to look at an alternative fight to help big Air Force figure out how it's going to win in a different world with a merger of new technology coupled to the existing platforms we have. So they come up with their list. These are the areas that we really need to get after to deal with a peer fight in a contested environment. Next slide. And so, my point here is to say we can align ourselves with any of those lists, and we do, depending on who asks the question. From an internal perspective, an inside baseball perspective, we see ourselves as core technical competencies. We have a vibrant, constantly changing set of core technical competencies and the work that's going on underneath them. Right now, there's roughly 30 of them spread across the technical directorates. We shift based on the demand signals, and I'll give you a sense of what some of those demand signals are here in a moment, which will give you a sense of where we are macroscopically changing our research areas. But as part of this bookkeeping, if you will, we routinely capture areas of increased emphasis. So these are areas where individual organizations have said we're going to put more money in this versus that. And areas of decreased emphasis, and so we like to have this out front. Sometimes the knock on the lab is you guys keep working the same old things, and I would argue that's just not true. We're constantly trying to adapt to what the demand signals are. Next slide. So we are pivoting. Just to give you a sense, we had pivoted in the past, so this gives you a sense of some of the macro changes. There are 4. I would argue that we are pivoting right now at a scale and at a magnitude that we've never had to pivot before in this certain time frame. And it's driven by 4 concurrent activities that have happened. And if you hit the next slide, on the bottom left, the publishing of the National Defense Strategy. You should Google it if you haven't read it. This is about, the fight in the desert is no longer the fight that we need to be prepared for in the future. And it gives you a sense of what we need to do differently. The research lab, in part due to that, took a step back and said, what do we need to be successful in the future if what we have today is not going to work? And so we generated and published what's called a Air Force Science and Technology Strategy. It's called the 2030 Strategy, looking at how we needed to change. And so there's an implementation plan for that. And so we're trying to drive lots of new activities to help us pivot based on the tenets that are in that document. The upper right, about 14 months ago, December 19th, 2020, no, December 20th, 2019, I always get them confused. We stood up a separate service, United States Space Force. And instead of standing up a separate research lab like Army has ARL and Navy has NRL, the Air Force Research Lab was anointed the one lab for 2 services. And there's lots of reasons why. I think it's a smart move to do that. But as the Space Force has matured and developed, and their priorities getting more and more high-level visibility, it has forced a pivot in terms of where the Air Force where the AFRL needs to pivot its resources. And then the 4th macro change, which we just heard a tidbit about, is the incorporation of AFworks into our ecosystem. Absolutely critical. I don't know what happened. I lost the slide. Anyone else see the slides?
I'm sorry, it must be me. Just give me a second. I don't know what happened. Somehow I lost it too. There we go. I think we're back.
Okay, great. So AFworks coming into our ecosystem is timely and it's needed. And the ownership of R&D by the military, you know, where it used to be 80-20 military, 20 commercial, it's flipped. And so the entire ecosystem needs to do a better job of coupling with commercial. And as the Agility Prime discussion showed, tapping into commercial and venture investments in areas that maybe we never really thought about using for an Air Force mission, but can we leverage that to think about how we might incorporate that so that, again, it's all about the fight with a different near peer so that we don't lose the market like we've lost the market on so many critical technologies to overseas. And so having AFWorks come in, as powerful as it is putting, you know, stressors on an ecosystem that is just not used to dealing with that. So that's led to four what I call macro shifts in the portfolio. And then I'll get off the stage here. Technologies for the future fight. Like I said, the future fight's going to be different. You know, we're not going to be able to fly our F-16s and F-22s in there and have tankers out there that can fuel them whenever they want and get in there whenever they want. It's a contested environment. It needs a different set of warfighting capability, and that's driving a whole discussion of what are the other things we need to do to make sure that we can survive and thrive in a contested environment. And so AFWorks futures priority list is shown there. I'm not going to go into detail. You know, to me, there are 5 major drivers. One is we really need a connected sensing grid, something that's joint. We have 3 airplanes right now that are all manufactured by the same company who can't talk to each other. That's just not going to fly in the future. So we really need to build a kill web, if you want, a mesh web, a connected sensing grid that not only connects Air Force activities, but Space Force, Army, and the Navy. And that's putting a lot of emphasis in the IT side, and things like ABMS and JADC2, which have been in the press a lot, are really the impetus for that. Really need to affect target to include left of launch. You know, it's about deterrence, you know, and if they know you can do things left of launch, they know that that we can see, etc. So things like cyber, things like space, SSA, etc. In a fight over there, the tyranny in distance and time, you know, if you look at a map, you look at the Pacific, you know, it's not easy to get over there. It's not easy to bring effect on a time scale that's relevant. And so how do we do things differently? Acknowledging that it'll be contested. We probably won't have runways. We probably won't have GPS. You know, what are the things that we need to be doing as a service down the road to build those capabilities? And then, as I asked Angie earlier, you know, as part of that, you know, there's a sense that we're going to try to shower them with mass, low cost, lots of vehicles, you know, to make their world a lot easier. We're just not going to be able to afford to send in lots of high-end platforms and lose them. And so, you know, there's a big push right now to do attritable low-cost vehicles and all of the technologies that go on to it. Angie talked about E-Series. I would say there's a series even below that too, somewhere above a munition, but things that you've heard in the press, or may have heard in the press, things like Skyboard and Golden Horde of, you know, things that are coupled together, but that we are not too worried if we lose them. Next slide. Space priorities. Again, lots of technology pushes here, and I'll just say it's a stressor. It's a good stressor, I think, for AFRL, who has primarily probably unconscious bias towards the air domain. Space world is completely different now, completely opened up, and you know, it's a warfighting domain now. And we used to not say that in public, but that's being said in public right now. And if you look at the explosion of people up there, if you look at the explosion of things that are up there, and you look at the explosion of what, our near peer competitors are doing, it's mind-boggling. China just landed a rover on the backside of the moon. So it's something we need to be worried about. And that couples into this discussion we were just having about AFworks, and that is, and I think space is a great example, that there is a push to partner with non-traditional, and instead of the lab having an invented here syndrome of we're gonna, me and my sandbox is gonna push the thing that I invented. We really need to look to commercial, rapidly adapt commercial, be able to partner with our partners, particularly international partners, at a scale that we haven't been able to do before. Next slide. And then this is really more of an internal look. So macro shifts in the portfolio as it relates to AFRL, more from an ops perspective. Angie talked about the digital trinity. Those are the three things there. AFRL is also trying to pivot, digital engineering, agile software, open systems, all of the things that we're trying to push into industry. How do we have a workforce that's more digitally literate? How do we enable our business systems to be more digital so that we can function quicker? Everything that we need to do within the family, as they say, to go digital is a big push right now. Trying to do transformational capability development on a time scale differently than we've done in the past to get after this valley of death discussion that we were talking about before. And then again, I would argue, AFRL has phenomenal people. They do phenomenal things. They're providing product every day. But the one knock from my perspective is we work in what I would call cylinders of excellence. Each of the TDs, is their own little ecosystem. And I really think for the fight that we're going to be in, we're going to have to be working multidisciplinary solutions and teams. And so there's a real push internally to try to get some better coupling across the AFRL cylinders. Next slide. So going back to ManTech Manufacturing, my roots. So as you know, the Materials Manufacturing Directorate within AFRL is the executive agent for the Air Force ManTech program, the DPA, Defense Production Act work, all of that sort of stuff came out of, it sits in that directorate. They have a strategic vision on the upper left, lots of great historical impacts that they made over the years, which JR will be on later, I'm sure he can talk to. But just to give you a sense, they are also trying to shift and some current foci, again, coalescence of digital design with digital manufacturing to maybe not get after to the question earlier of how do I remake something, but how do I make those things that I can't make now any other way? What design space does that open up to allow me to do something differently? Lots of discussion on AI and robotics and automation from a manufacturing perspective. Lots of concern about industrial base health. I mean, this COVID thing has seen, the DPA, Defense Production Act, has really ramped up, and Chuck Ward, who I know some of you know, has done a great job scaling it up. There's also a lot of concern with the supply chains right now. So there's lots of small companies out there that if you do some deep analysis, you maybe don't want to be interacting with because of who they have ties with, who their investors are. And, I think there's going to be a more, I don't want to say scrutiny, but there's going to be more awareness that we need to understand who we're working with. Trying to go to open systems and, open up the tech data packages to, again, get after the digital trinity. And then, emergence of non-traditional manufacturing techniques. The bio ecosystem is a big ecosystem. There's lots of Air Force needs there. But when we typically think of manufacturing, we think of casting and, composites and, the more classic structural materials. But there's lots of manufacturing needs on the more functional material side of the house. Next slide. So how do you work with us? I would say there's three major ways. I would say a lot of people look at us as a funding source, which I don't really like. I think our job is really to work collaboratively with university and industry. We understand the state of the art as well as you do in your local domain. And when you add those two things with our understanding of the warfighter needs, we can get after some things to really do a better job of connecting and developing and exploiting the S&T that we need to go. Direct funding, yeah, we put, probably half of our money out on the street in one way, shape, or form, again, to reduce risk in industry via the TDs, via the ManTech program. With academia, we do it primarily through OSR. You just heard about the AFworks ecosystem, trying to get after, a different set of practitioners, if you will, than the normal ones. We do a lot of partnerships, including the ManTech Institutes Angie referenced earlier. They are executed out of our AFRL Materials Manufacturing Directorate. And then, again, pre-COVID, through lots of information exchanges, and look forward to helping connect the dots on any and all of these as the case may be, given the perch that I sit in. Next slide. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, so again, here, a couple of websites. My email is here. I'd be happy to take any questions with the group. Happy to answer any questions one-on-one via email. And, don't be shy. We're all part of the same community. Over.
What a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. We really laid it all out, from understanding the structure and pivoting. And I'll tell you, as a U.S. citizen, I definitely am finding comfort in knowing that we are really looking at this new warfare that we're getting involved with as being so different than traditional. Other questions? Do we have some questions out here? Kathy, do we have any questions from our folks on the YouTube?
I got a question.
Yes. Identify yourself.
This is George.
Oh, hi, George.
How are you?
Always count on you for a question.
Sometimes difficult. Dr. Bunning, that was a very good presentation and pretty comprehensive. In 2012, Secretary Gates put out a letter in which he said that electromagnetic effects on warfare and measures and countermeasures were in his top 5 priorities. And I don't even see the word anywhere in the presentation now. So it gets to be, where does it fit in? Because if we don't pay attention to it, we're going to wake up one day and our computers aren't going to work, and our data is going to be gone, and people are going to be getting sick, and nobody's going to know why.
Yeah, so I'll just answer it this way. The reason you don't see it is because it goes behind closed doors very, very quickly. And we, in a setting like this, we don't put it on charts. We don't talk about it. Over.
My apologies.
Good question, but it can't be answered. Are there other questions? Kathy, are there any questions from YouTube?
We just have one question. Who should we contact to present a company to AFWorks or Agility Prime?
So I didn't quite hear all of it. Something about a company, who they should contact with regard to Agility Prime? Is that the question?
Exactly. How does a company interact with Agility Prime? Boy, it's so easy to interact with them. Once you get hooked in, they become your best friend, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I would do is I would go to Nate, or the major and say, what's going on. I don't know where they are in terms of their solicitations and all of that, but there's definitely opportunity there. Over.
Well, I can answer that. You just go to their website, go to the AFwork website, go to the Agility Prime section. That's where the STTRs are. That's where all of the videos from all of the working sessions that they've had are. And there are also links to directly engage. So it's very easy. And then once you sign up to be part of the ecosystem, as they say, You will be inundated with emails from AFWork because they really keep in touch with the ecosystem as to what they're doing. They're very easy to interact with. Other questions? Well, you told us everything we need to know. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your participation.
Sure, take care.
Look forward to doing more things and working with you in the future. Thank you.